Welcome to LOA Today. I'm Walt Thiessen here with life coach Cindie Chavez. Today is Wednesday, January the 8th, 2020. It is 4 p.m. New York time, and wherever you are in the world, thank you for joining us for another episode of LOA Today. And I've got to stop all the noise over here, so give me a second. I got too many inputs going on right now. That's all there is to it. Okay, I just shut myself up. That's good. So, Cindie, hey, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well. How are you? Happy New Year.
Happy New Year! Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's great to be in 2020, which I'm calling the year of clarity, and I'm discovering all the different ways that I am discovering clarity. We're only 8 days in, and already I found a whole bunch of them. I mean, we're
Right?
doing good, you know?
Excellent.
Yeah, yeah, and as usual, most of them are, shall we call them two by four lessons?
Oh,
So, I'm working on it, but hey, I'm learning from it. That's the main thing. I'm learning a lot of good stuff. Today, just before the podcast, I won't try to explain exactly what I learned because most people won't get the technical side of it. But basically, I learned that the approach I was taking to programming wasn't going to work. Very simply,
oh,
in a nutshell, which is a very good thing to discover before you get very far. you know,
this is true.
so that's the way I'm looking at it. Like, okay, I now understand why I was running into so many problems. I now understand why I was in this place of, one thing after another, frustrating the heck out of me. Now I have a clearer path. So clarity actually, I mean, it was a two by four, but clarity actually helped.
Well, I kind of think of things in that way. I remind myself that it's part of the process,
It is.
especially with learning curves that have to do with anything with the computer, with, you know, anything that's computer writing code, whatever. Because even just learning new software sometimes is like, oh, especially when you know the old program so well, you can do it in your
Yep.
sleep, and then you get a new one, everything's different. And so at one point I used to get so frustrated about it, and I thought, you know what? I have to make this okay. I have to decide
Hmm.
that all of the, I'm making air quotes, right? But setbacks, all the setbacks, I just have to make that okay. I just have to say that's part of the process. It always happens. It always will. It's okay. It's not something going wrong, right? And everything seems like a lot easier after that.
Well, it does. You're right.
Yeah.
And kind of as a corollary to what you're talking about, I mean, I just described it as a two by four,
Yeah.
but really, I mean, we're not talking about any severe pain going on here.
Yeah.
It's not like I have blood dripping from my head or something like that. No,
Right.
it's more like sitting back and saying, "Oh, I just wasted the last 2 weeks. Why did I do that?" That's the kind of two by four we're
Yeah.
talking about.
But it really wasn't a waste. And I guess that's what I'm saying. Like
Yes,
we make that proclamation, but then in the end we realize, well, we really learned some important things. And,
and that's it.
if nothing else, we develop more patience or whatever happened, right? What I've been doing, I love that you said 2020, the year of clarity, because I think I've recognized over the last few years that that might be the most important thing.
Yes.
Because, when you're in sales, there's a saying that people talk about when you're in sales. You say the confused mind always says no. Right. So it's like when you're pitching something to someone and you're giving them all these details, and they're confused because they're, not an expert like you are, and you're giving them all this stuff and it's just way too much. They're probably not going to buy it from you because it's just confusing. So let it be easy and let it be simple. But I think that that's a great idea for all of life. It's like
Mm.
when we have confusion on any level, everything's harder. And so getting clear about what we want, right? Getting clear about anything. So I love the year of clarity. I love that.
I do too. Yeah.
Always easier when we're clear about it.
I mean, it has the obvious corollary to 2020 vision. That's where I
Right,
got the idea from.
exactly.
Yeah. But it is clarity. And in fact, you're right. The last 2 weeks, one way to look at it is the two by four. The other way to look at it is tremendous clarity. I mean, I achieved a lot of clarity
Yeah,
today about 10 minutes before I took a break and then came back to do the show. I mean, that's how recent I received the clarity.
excellent.
And Abraham Hicks, they have their 22-point emotional guidance scale that you can use to figure out, well, where you are with your own emotional state and where's the next level to get up to and so forth. If you look at the top level has 5 or 6 different descriptors, one of which is clarity.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Clarity is a very, very high vibrational state. It's
I don't know if
equivalent
I
to
ever
joy
noticed
and
that.
happiness. Yeah, it's right at the top.
Yeah.
So Clarity is a good thing. Clarity is a very, very good thing.
I talked to somebody this week who was wanting to hire me as a coach. And in the discussion, I asked this question. I said, okay, one of my packages is just 3 sessions with me. So we're just gonna hypothetically say you've just said yes to hiring me for 3 sessions.
Sure. Okay.
At the end of the 3rd session, what would you like to have accomplished? And they said, oh my gosh, I have absolutely no idea. And I said, well, then I can't help you get there. Right?
You can't get there from here.
And I use the analogy, it might be silly, but I said, if you go into a restaurant and the server keeps coming over to take, and you keep saying, I'm not sure. I have no idea. I don't know. Right. They may just keep giving you more time, and they may say, well, some people like this, maybe you like that. But until you can say, this is what I want, they may end up just finally kicking you out, right? Because they can't deliver unless, so you can't have what you want if you don't know what it is. And I think that is maybe the most important thing to understand about life, about law of attraction, about all of it. So this is the year.
It is the year. I feel it in my bones. I think I've said numerous times, and I continue to believe this. This is something that's going to be true for large numbers. I would number in the millions of people. I believe that 2020 is going to be a year where millions of people achieve levels of clarity way beyond anything they've ever done before.
Yes.
That's what I believe.
I'm holding that vision with you. Yes.
Yeah, I'm there. So anyway, we are 3 weeks away from having done our last episode on Neville Day, because Wednesday is Neville Day, almost to the point where I almost forgot where we were. So
I know. Right?
And to make things even more complicated, we'll be doing Neville for the next 2 weeks. And then after that, Louise and I are heading off to Florida. So we're going to miss some time. And then we'll come back and finish up some Neville again. So, I mean, it could be a while before we get to this relatively short book. That's what I
know, but the way I always look at it, it's like, go back and just review, if you want, because this stuff we can read it over and over and over. There's something new every time. It's always got something there. So I've said this from the very beginning. If we just did one Neville book over and over, it would still have something new every time we did it.
It would.
That's the nature of the process, and Neville, Neville
and us, because we every time we look at it, it's a fresh look from a new perspective of where we are at that point in time in our lives, which is different from the point of time 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 3 days ago. Right. I mean, it's always a different perspective.
There's a saying that you can't, what is it? It's like you never step in the same river twice.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's like this. I mean, we're different. The words on the page might not change, but our understanding of it does, and we're different people every time. So go back and review as you wait for the next one. But I'm excited. I know I'm going to open space for you to do announcements, but when I look to see, because I did the same thing, I was like, wait, what chapter are we on?
Right.
It seems it's been, we haven't been together since last year.
Yeah.
So I looked it up, and the name of the chapter is The Game of Life, which got me really excited for another reason, and that is that one of my other favorite old-timey New Thought teachers is Florence Scovill Schinn, and her big famous book was called The Game of Life and How to Play It. So when I saw that chapter title, I kind of went, wait, yeah. Yay. So I think it's going to be exciting, but I know there's announcements to be made first, so
well, let's do those. First and foremost, if you're not yet subscribing to the podcast, please do so. Most of you know how to do it, but for those who aren't quite sure where to go, the easiest thing is just go to loatoday.net webpage, and at the top you'll see little instructions that you can do, usually in 1 or 2 clicks, how to subscribe, and it's really, really quick. And then from that point on, all of our shows come streaming right to your device as we publish them. Also, check us out on YouTube, because we live stream to YouTube as we are recording these podcasts, and so you can actually watch us. You can see what we look like while we're doing these shows. Just go to YouTube and do a search for LOA Today Podcast Videos. We'll pop right up. Click the subscribe button, click the little bell so you get notified whenever we do a show, and just like that, you'll be able to follow along on YouTube. And we also have a group that I started up a year ago and then kind of restarted in November on Facebook called the Law of Attraction Pivot Pals. And Pivot Pals is about coming into a very safe environment to share what Cindie and I call your vignette, your little thing that you're trying to imagine and bring into reality using the law of attraction. Basically, you share your vignette. Everybody else piles on and says, yeah, go, go, go. And then you go back every single day and you review your vignette. Because, Cindie, that's the thing that I am realizing we are most often lax at. Reviewing the thing that we're trying to attract to keep building the vibration up. Most of us, like if we do like a 30-day affirmation or something like that, we stop after 3 days if we get that far.
Well, and I think another thing that happens is we create a vignette, and then at least I know this has happened to me, and I may be consistent with it for a few days, and then it's like something else, shiny object. Oh, and I create another vignette, right? It's like, and it's difficult for me sometimes to create one and stay with it. Like with that one until, all these people that we read about in the Neville books that created their little scene and then imagined it every day. And maybe every day in the day, and then every night as they're falling asleep, and then every day and every night and every day and every night. And we hear them say, we read their stories and they say 3 weeks later.
Right. 3 weeks later.
They didn't just do it for 2 days and then forget about it. They kept going until the thing came about. And so, I'm raising my hand. I'm guilty of not following through with holding the vision for something. It's really funny because I hold the vision for my clients for this podcast. And for some reason, those things like I'm very consistent about, but then I'll create something in my own mind and
yeah. Well, it's
not
easier.
all the time, but sometimes, I'll think of something and won't follow through. The times that I do follow through, the things happen, and sometimes in days.
Oh yeah, it can happen really quickly.
So it's a great thing to remember. Just be consistent.
Consistency is huge. Yeah, and like you say, I think we were surprised in the last book, The Law and the Promise. That's the last one we reviewed of Neville's. That there was actually a story where they only did it once. It's like, oh my God.
Right. I think was that the story about the hat? Yeah, I remember that.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, she pretended that she was putting on a hat in the mirror, I think, and admired it. It wasn't even there. She just pretended and admired it, and then went off and then went to lunch, and there was a woman with the hat on. She complimented her, and then 2 days later it arrived.
Right.
She said, I didn't really ever like this hat, but I thought you did, and so here, you have it. It's like, oh my goodness. Okay. Awesome.
So that's the exception. The rule is that every other story in Neville, his books are just chock full of stories. Every other story is where they keep reviewing it over and over again. So there's a lesson in there. Like, that's where you have the big power. Well,
the thing that's interesting to me is that we have read quite a few stories, and the majority, at least in my recollection, the majority of them that give a time, some of them don't.
Right.
But the ones that do, it was weeks.
That's right.
Like we had a bunch of stories in a row where the person said 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later. And I'm like, I have a friend that she and her husband remodel houses, and they live in the houses while they're doing it. So they'll buy a house and completely turn it into a show place, and then they'll sell it and move on to the next one. And they love doing it. But since they're living there while it's happening, oftentimes they're living without a kitchen for a little while, right? Or the floor in a room will be torn up or whatever. And she always says, well, it's only going to take, the floor will be in 2 weeks. I can do anything for 2 weeks, right? It's not forever. It's just for a couple of weeks. And I always think of this Neville thing. I'm like, if we really understood the power in consistency, holding the vision for something for a few weeks wouldn't be a big deal.
That's right.
And so, but so often it's that we just quit.
We do.
Right?
We give up so easily. Well, you identified it really nicely. You talked about how it's so easy for you to hold a vision for your clients, or it's so easy for you to hold a vision for listeners when we're doing the podcast, but it's so much harder to do it for ourselves. Yeah. And that's true. It is easier to hold it for somebody else. Yeah. And I think it's because we don't have as much resistance built up. We don't have all that emotional angst associated with
Absolutely.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. I told a client the other day, they said, well, I have trouble believing this. I said, well, I don't. I see it. So don't prove me wrong here. Like, I see it. I love it. So, yeah. Anyway, I'm excited to start this chapter.
Yeah, let's do it.
Chapter 5 of Neville Goddard's Seedtime and Harvest, this little bitty book that's going to take us forever to get through, but it's fine. It's called The Game of Life. And like I said, that got me exciting. He starts with a quote from Shakespeare. I laughed when I read this earlier. I can easier teach 20 what were good to be done than be one of the 20 to follow my own teaching.
Didn't we just say that?
Just what we were talking
I mean, come on.
about?
This stuff is spooky how this happens.
I know. He says, with this confession, now this is Neville talking, this is what made me laugh. With this confession off my mind, I will now teach you how to play the game of life. So he's like, yeah, it's easier for me to teach you than for me to do it myself. Okay, so
a little window to Neville's soul going on there.
Well, it's like we can all breathe a little sigh of relief. You know, if Neville's telling us that it's easier to talk about it than actually do it, then we can say, okay. Life is a game, and like all games, has its aims and its rules. In the little games that men concoct, such as cricket, tennis, baseball, football, and so on, the rules may be changed from time to time. After the changes are agreed upon, man must learn the new rules and play the game within the framework of the accepted rules. However, in the game of life, the rules cannot be changed or broken. Only within the framework of its universal and everlastingly fixed rules can the game of life be played. The game of life is played on the playing field of the mind. In playing a game, the first thing we ask is, what is its aim and purpose? And the second, what are the rules governing the game? In the game of life, our chief aim is towards increasing awareness, an awareness of things of greater significance. And our second aim is towards achieving our goals, realizing our desires. As to our desires, the rules reach only so far as to indicate the way in which we should go to realize them, but the desires themselves must be the individual's own concern. The rules governing the game of life are simple, but it takes a lifetime of practice to use them wisely. Here is one of the rules. And he quotes from Proverbs, as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. Thinking is usually believed to be a function entirely untrammeled and free, without any rules to constrain it, but that is not true. Thinking moves by its own processes in a bounded territory with definite paths and patterns. Thinking follows the tracks laid down in one's own inner conversations. I want to stop there for a second and point out a couple things that stood out to me when I read this.
Okay.
The first one is that when he says thinking moves by its own processes in a bounded territory with definite paths and patterns. We've all heard over the last decade all of these things about brain science and neural connections and neural pathways. So I think it's interesting that Neville uses these words, in other words, that he says bounded and that he said paths. Mm-hmm. Because literally by thinking the same thoughts over and over and doing the same things, we create neural pathways that make it easier. That's why we have muscle memory. That's why things that we practice get easier and easier. That's why you can hop in your car and drive over to your friend's house or to the store that you go to all the time and practically, do it in your sleep. Hope not literally, but it's like, it's easy, right? You don't have to really think about it too much. And so Neville is talking about that right here with paths in the brain, with thoughts having definite paths and patterns. And then he says thinking follows the tracks laid down in one's own inner conversations. There is a saying from one of the astrologers that I really love, and Caroline W. Casey. She says, imagination lays the tracks for the reality train.
That's cute.
And when I read that, I thought about that. That our thinking follows tracks laid down in one's own inner conversations. I said to somebody this week, you've heard me say lately, like, I don't really have any beliefs. I'm training myself to not have any beliefs. I just say I like to entertain certain possibilities. But I said to a client, if I do have one belief that I hold, is that our story is what creates our experience.
Yes.
And I would think that story is what Neville is talking about when he says our inner conversation. There's lots and bits and pieces to our story, but we do this all the time. We label ourselves in certain ways
Mm-hmm.
with our likes and, oh, I don't like that. And, oh, I really like this. And I don't care for that. And with our preferences, we create like a story about ourselves that we say over and over. We talk about it so much. And if we've had any kind of trauma or any kind of circumstance that we've, survived, we often tell that story over and over. And so it just starts replicating. And I think that's what Neville is really getting at when he says thinking follows the tracks laid down in one's own inner conversations. He says all of us can realize our objectives by the
Before
wise.
you go on, I want to add to that.
Yes, please do.
Because what you said is perfect. I love it. But it also occurred to me that there are a few ways you can look at that phrase. Thinking follows the tracks laid down in one's own inner conversations. Well, what are some of the tracks we lay down non-deliberately? They're the things that we habitually do over and over again every single day. So we watch the same television show over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And then we expect different results. Well, wait a minute. You're laying down some pretty solid tracks there, and they aren't going to really change until you change where your tracks are going. So, we really shouldn't be surprised about the truth of that.
And we've talked about this before. People that when we say things about ourselves, like some of them are so common when I say them, and I don't say these about myself, but they're so common. If I say them, you'll just recognize other people or yourself saying them, right? It's like, I'm not good at names.
Yes, right.
I'm not good at math.
Mm-hmm.
I always remember a face, right? These are things that they're like cliche because we hear them or say them so much. And when we're constantly saying that, it starts to create a reality about it.
It does. Yeah. I mean, you said that you really want to have no beliefs. And I understand what you mean by that. But I also am reminded that a belief is a thought we've been thinking about for a long time. And,
right.
The longer we think about it, the more it becomes a strong belief. So,
right. It's like a thought we become married to.
It does.
Yeah.
So what when you said, I don't want to have any beliefs, I think what you're really saying is I don't want to get stuck in the rut with any of these things that I've been thinking about over and over again. Right.
Exactly. And I love that, that you brought out this about thinking following tracks laid down in our inner conversation, that it's not just inner conversation, but it's our consistent actions as well.
Yeah, they go together.
Everything starts following those tracks.
Mm-hmm.
So Neville says all of us can realize our objectives by the wise use of mind and speech. All of us. Want to really
triple underline.
Right? I like that. All of us. Most of us are totally unaware of the mental activity which goes on within us. But to play the game of life successfully, we must become aware of our every mental activity. For this activity, in the form of inner conversations, is the cause of the outer phenomena of our life. Every idle word that man shall speak, they shall give account thereof in the day of judgment. For by thy words thou shalt be justified, and by thy words thou shalt be condemned. He's quoting from the Christian Bible in Matthew. Then he says, the law of the word cannot be broken. A bone of him shall not be broken, quoting another quote from the book of John. He goes on to say, the law of the word never overlooks an inner word, nor makes the smallest allowance for our ignorance of its power. It fashions life about us as we, by our inner conversations, fashion life within ourselves. This is done to reveal to us our position on the playing field of life. There is no opponent in the game of life. There's only the goal. We often, we've often talked about getting in our own way.
Yes. Or,
people, there's a saying, it's like, I am my own worst enemy or whatever. Mm-hmm. I think when Neville says there's no opponent in the game of life, only the goal, we could also say it's like it's all us.
it reminds me of a line that came from a relatively recent movie. It came out, I would say, late 90s, early 2000s. I can't remember exactly when it was. It was called The Legend of Bagger Vance, and it was the story
I saw this movie. A golfer?
A golfer and a caddy.
Okay.
The golfer had gone through World War I and been traumatized and so forth, but he was also the local golf hero, and he was going to play in a match against Bobby Jones and Walter Hagen, the two best golfers of that generation.
Uh-huh.
And it's the story of basically how he rediscovers his swing and has this caddy played by Will Smith, who helps him rediscover his swing. Well, in the course of doing all of that, Will Smith's character says golf is a game that you cannot win. You can only play it. And I thought, that's brilliant. That is a brilliant way of expressing it. You cannot win the game. You can only play it.
You could say that about life, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So true. So we want to play it well.
That's right.
Yeah. Neville says, not long ago, I was discussing this with a successful and philanthropic businessman, and he told me a thought-provoking story about himself. He said, you know, Neville, I first learned about goals in life when I was 14, and it was on the playing field at school. I was good at track and had a fine day, but there was one more race to run, and I had stiff competition in one other boy. I was determined to beat him. I beat him, it is true, but while I was keeping my eye on him, a third boy, who was considered no competition at all, won the race. That experience taught me a lesson I've used throughout my life. When people ask me about my success, I must say that I believe it is because I've never made making money my goal. My goal is the wise, productive use of money. Neville says this man's inner conversations are based on the premise that he already has money. His constant inner question is the proper use of it. The inner conversations of the man struggling to get money only prove his lack of money. In his ignorance of the power of the word, he is building barriers in the way of the attainment of his goal. He has his eye on the competition rather than on the goal itself.
And every one of us can say, yeah, we've done that. We know what that feeling is.
Yeah.
That's a very, very familiar feeling.
I think it is kin to how often we find ourselves focusing on the how.
Yes.
Instead of on the goal. And especially where money's concerned. And I think that's just because the world we live in requires exchange, requires money for almost everything. So often we make that the goal, but the truth is, if you had a room full of cash and it couldn't be spent, that's not really what you want.
That's right.
Right? You don't want, $1 million that's tied up somewhere and you can't use it. You want what you think that money will buy you. And for some people, it's not even really tangible. Some people will say, oh, I really want to travel. I mean, that's one thing I really want to do. And extra money, that's where I want to put it, right? I want to travel.
Sure.
And so it doesn't really matter whether money comes in and I spend it on travel, or I don't know, I obtain the ability to travel some other way. That's not really important. For some people, it's not even anything tangible. It's like they want to feel secure. They would feel secure if they had more money. They would feel safe. They would feel like they had more freedom. Those are all things that money can't really give us.
It's true. In fact, you elicited two thoughts as you were describing that. First, talking about how it isn't necessarily about acquiring money in order to travel, because there are a number of different ways to travel. My sister has a good friend who, by virtually any definition you can come up with, would be qualified as poor. She never has a ton of money. She travels every year.
Yeah.
And she travels paid for by somebody else. And it's always a different person.
Right.
it's like,
yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, she could do it practically on demand. If she wants to go someplace to do something, the right person shows up to help fund the way so she can do it.
Yeah. I was talking to somebody the other day about how often also we can hook goals that we say we have to money. Like, for instance, the famous question that coaches ask sometimes is, okay, let's say you won the lottery. And really all that means is, let's say you don't have any worries about money. Everything's taken care of. What would you do? And some people say things like, oh, I would start making art. I would write a book. I would take up acting. Yes. I would learn how to whatever. And it's like, none of that is prohibited by your lack of money.
That's right.
Right? It's like, if you have a pencil and a piece of paper, you can start writing your book. You don't have to wait until you're wealthy to do it, And so sometimes we hook everything to that sense when it doesn't really need to be. So I think it's
And not just
interesting.
money, by the way. We also do it with
Oh,
other things.
all
I mean,
kinds of things. Yes.
relationships comes to mind, right?
Yeah,
You know,
right.
how many people say they want to have they're a special someone to have the relationship with?
Right.
You know, so they want that special relationship. They don't have that special relationship, but they really want. How can I find that one special person?
Mhm.
Not realizing that you don't have to find that one special person in order to have good relationships. They're actually postponing having the relationship until they find the special someone,
Yeah, that's
which is
so
really
true.
something.
And it's a really good point. Like, thank you for making that point, because that's actually how you end up with the special person.
Yes.
Is you let go of the important, I've been talking about this all week to people that I've been coaching about unhooking from the importance of something a little bit, dial it back a little bit, because all the things that we think are so important that we start hanging everything on like that, it just creates so much resistance. It's just
Yep.
like, if we can learn how to just, I literally have been this week doing this. I've been sort of asking myself very quickly. I mean, it's become a process that happens very quickly, but anytime I recognize that something's has a bit of an emotional charge for me, or I feel stuck or anything like that, I take a look at what I've got going on and just dial back the importance. Like, in other words, like you said earlier, right? You said like a 2x4 moment.
Right.
And then a few minutes later, you say, it's not like I'm bleeding from the head, right?
Right.
So it's like a 2x4 moment. It's like a 9 on a 10 scale.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe this is a 3, right?
Yeah,
I've
right.
been doing that with myself all week. I'm like, anytime you find yourself really stuck or really upset or frustrated or anything, it's always because there's just too much importance put on whatever's happening. And to stand back and say, this is not really that important. Or even if it is, can I pretend it's not?
That's good.
Just turn the dial down a little bit, and you'll recognize it eases the tension involved from putting so much importance on something.
The one kind of thing I can think of that has the greatest tendency to put too much importance on it, and it's almost incalculable how much importance you can put on it, because it seems like, well, you can't make it important enough, is health. If you're sick, if you're dealing with some sort of a chronic condition, maybe you have a life-threatening condition or something like that, it's really hard to play that down. It's really hard to say that's not the most important thing in my life.
I will tell you something. I will show you my
Ooh.
wrist brace that I've been wearing because I've overworked my hand. And I'm very grateful this week for being able to paint and write and knit and do every other thing I do with my right hand. I am right-handed because I haven't been able to use it.
Mm-hmm.
And at first I was saying, when I figured it out, when I realized what it is, oh, this is de Quervain's stenotendivitis. But now I'm just saying I'm healing.
Yeah.
Right? My hand is healing. Not my hand is hurt, not my hand is injured, not my hand is out of commission. My hand is healing.
Yeah.
Because I'm wearing the brace, I'm putting ice on it, I'm doing all the things, right? I'm taking the mundane action.
Right.
I'm visualizing it. I'm picturing myself using my hand again perfectly with no pain. And they said I'd be in the wrist brace for 6 weeks. I've been in the wrist brace since Friday, and it's about 30 or 40% better.
I love it.
Why? Because it's healing. I'm healing. That's the difference in the framing of it, right?
Absolutely.
I'm healing. So you're talking about that there's almost nothing as important as our health. I mean, anyone who is experiencing any level of ill health or being unwell agrees, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your health is everything. If you've got a wonderful partner and all the money in the world, but you're sick in bed, it's just, right? So that's the frame, though, because we all go through times when, there's dis-ease, there's a situation where we're unwell, and it's to recognize that we're healing. I love the idea that every symptom is a healing gesture. And I've been telling myself that my body's propensity is to heal. If I cut myself, what happens in a day or two? It's healing up. I can see it. The
That's
wound
right.
is closing up, it's healing up, it's scabbing over, it's getting well. I'm getting well. My wrist is healing. So that's it, I think, in a nutshell.
I knew there was a good reason for me to bring up the health thing because on Monday, Louis D'Souza, who does the show with Astrid Kaufman and me, informed us that he had had a skiing accident where he torn his calf muscle. Tu-
Ow! Ow!
Tuesday, I did the show with Alex, who was in a completely different place in the house because she'd thrown her back out. So the only way she could do the show was laying on the couch. Yesterday and today, my wife yesterday is telling me she has this massive headache. Today, she had tremendous levels of fatigue. I mean, and then now you're showing me with the wrist. I've had a thing going on with the palm of my right hand where I do all my mousing for my computer
Yes.
programming. You know, and it's all the same thing. They're all opportunities to reframe just the exact way you did it. I love the way you described that.
Yeah,
Perfect.
we're all healing this week.
We are here.
We're all getting well.
There's a whole bunch of healing going on. So good stuff. I love it. I love it.
That's good. All right. So I love this next quote that Neville uses. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings, from Julius Caesar, Act 1, Scene 2. He says, as the worlds were framed by the word of God, so we as imitators of God, as dear children, create the conditions and circumstances of our lives by our all-powerful human inner words. Without practice, the most profound knowledge of the game would produce no desired results. To him that knoweth to do good, that is, knoweth the rules, and doeth it not, to him it is sin. In other words, he will miss his mark and fail to realize his goal. I like this frame of life being a game for another reason, and that is that we're in the age of virtual reality.
Oh, yes.
Right, and video games and cheat codes, right? So Neville's giving us the cheat codes right
That's
now.
Right. Yeah. That's
And
it.
I've used this explanation with clients before. Like, let's say you're playing a game and you don't have the codes and no one has showed you the run through of the video game. And you keep hitting this one part that's just like the worst thing ever until someone tells you, oh no, that's actually really good. Keep going, because you think you're in the wrong direction. That's actually right where you want to be. So I've been using that forever in my coaching and in my life, is like deciding the rules of the game, deciding that when something happens that's uncomfortable or seems like it's really bad, I've just decided it's the best thing possible. So it's really funny to have that conditioned response, right? Or chosen response. You hurt your hand on the mouse. You go, yes, awesome.
Exactly.
Shifts the energy of everything when we do
It
this.
does, yeah.
Yes. So in the parable of the talents, the master's condemnation of the servant who neglected to use his gift is clear and unmistakable. And having discovered one of the rules of the game of life, we risk failure by ignoring it. The talent not used, like the limb not exercised, slumbers and finally atrophies. We must be doers of the word and not hearers only. Since thinking follows the tracks laid down in one's own inner conversations, not only can we see where we're going on the playing field of life by observing our inner conversations, but also we can determine where we will go by controlling and directing our inner talking. What would you think and say and do were you already the one you want to be? Begin to think and say and do this inwardly. You are told that there is a rod in heaven that revealeth secrets, and you must always remember that heaven is within you. And to make it crystal clear who God is, where he is, and what his secrets are, Daniel continues, quote, thy dream and thy visions of thy head are these. They reveal the tracks to which you are tied and point the direction in which you are going. This reminds me of many conversations that we have had, well, about identity, right? About it's who we are being. Who we are being. That person that we want to be. Like he says, what would you think and say and do? Were you already the one you want to be?
Right. Yes.
You're already the one that has that money in the bank. You're already the one that has written the bestseller. You're already one in a happy marriage. What would you think and say and do? Because that's where we want to go here.
Yeah.
He says,
Yeah,
this is what one woman did to turn the tracks to which she had been unhappily tied in the direction in which she wanted to go. For 2 years, she had kept herself estranged from the 3 people she loved most. She had had a quarrel with her daughter-in-law, who ordered her from her home. For those 2 years, she had not seen or heard from her son, her daughter-in-law, or her grandson, though she had sent her grandson numerous gifts in the meantime. Every time she thought of her family, which was daily, she carried on a mental conversation with her daughter-in-law, blaming her for the quarrel and accusing her of being selfish.
Talk about laying the tracks.
Right. And we do this though, right? We have a bad conversation with someone and we just run it over in our head over and over.
Oh yeah, replay
We've
it.
talked about revising it, right? I wonder if that's what's going to happen. Upon hearing a lecture of mine one night, it was this very lecture on the game of life and how to play it. She suddenly realized she was the cause of the prolonged silence and that she and she alone must do something about it. Recognizing that her goal was to have the former loving relationship, she set herself the task of completely changing her inner talking. That very night, in her imagination, she constructed 2 loving, tender letters written to her, one from her daughter-in-law and the other from her grandson. In her imagination, she read them over and over until she fell asleep in the joyful mood of having received the letters. She repeated this imaginary act each night for 8 nights. On the morning of the 9th day, she received one envelope containing 2 letters, one from her daughter-in-law, one from her grandson. They were loving, tender letters inviting her to visit them, almost replicas of those she had constructed mentally. By using her imagination consciously and lovingly, she had turned the tracks to which she was tied in the direction she wanted to go, towards a happy family reunion. A change of attitude is a change of position on the playing field of life. The game of life is not being played out there in what's called space and time. The real moves in the game of life take place within, on the playing field of the mind. And he quotes Lawrence Hausman to close up this chapter: losing thy soul again to find, rendering toward that goal thy separate mind.
Very interesting. Interesting a number of different ways, but the one that is kind of grabbing my attention the most is, once again, this time it was like less than 2 weeks. It was about an 8-day period, but
8 days. Period. The thing I started to think about was, I've mailed some letters recently that took 4 or 5 days to get there.
Yeah.
I don't know how long the post took in the time he's speaking of, but those letters were written to her probably a few days after, right? Because
exactly.
She received them on the morning of the 9th day.
So in the age of email, that same thing would have happened in 3 or 4 days, perhaps, something like that. Yeah.
Well, I have done this before myself, and I've talked about it on our podcast, and I've coached clients to do it. People have reached out to me via email that have heard on the podcast, and we've talked about it. And that is, if you have a conversation like this one, or an estrangement situation that happened because there was an argument, there were words said, chances are there is a part of that conversation, either part that the person said to you or part you said to them, or both, that you can't get out of your mind, that you're playing over and over. Yes. And I always say, first, how does that make you feel? Oh, it makes me feel terrible. Like every time I think about those words, I just feel constricted. I have a knot in my stomach. My shoulders are tight. I feel my heart aches. It's like, okay, what would you have rather the conversation been? Take those 3 sentences and change them into what you would like. And then imagine that that's what happened. Play that conversation over and over in your head. And I have seen real, honest to goodness results in relationships from just that one method, just that one thing.
It's an amazing thing. And
it's amazing.
Really what Neville is talking about here, he doesn't use the same terminology, but in Abraham Hicks' terms, he's talking about releasing resistance. And when you release resistance, that's when the amazing things happen. So he's basically describing a fairly straightforward way to release resistance. simply just start changing the story that you're telling.
That's it. You know, I always want to point out that when we are resistant, it's always uncomfortable. Resistance is not a comfortable place to be. Mm-hmm. But there is resistance in both directions. You know, in there's a form of Buddhist meditation where we talk about releasing or being free of attachment and aversion. So attachment is yes, I've got to have it this way. And aversion is no, I don't want that to happen, right? But they're both resistance.
They are. Yeah.
And so, you know, it's when we change the scenario in our mind, it just feels better. Like you said, we just release it. We release the resistance that comes with that uncomfortable situation. But we need to be consistent with it as well and keep doing it until the outward phenomena, like Neville says, actually changes.
Now, there is another factor that can kind of trip us up, I guess you might say. Alex and I were talking about it yesterday. The factor of being so out of practice to the thing that we really want that we have trouble expressing it. So, for instance, what was it we were talking about yesterday? I think we were talking about various medical and mental conditions that she's been diagnosed with and so forth. And so I asked her at one point to effectively turn it around and turn it into, okay, what condition would you like instead? And she drew a blank. She was so attuned to that way of thinking in terms of medical diagnoses and prognoses and so forth. Thinking about it in terms of what she wanted instead was just foreign language practically. Yeah. I mean, that's where we can really get stuck. Talk about resistance. That's so much resistance, we can't even remember what it is that we want. And that goes back to what you talked about at the beginning, knowing what you want.
Well, it reminds me of the beginning of, it's been a year now, because it was January of 2019. The very first or second podcast of the year, I think we were still doing the early morning podcasts.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I woke up one morning with a little bit of a sore throat. My ears hurt a little bit. Just, you know, that I always just call it the coming down with something feeling. And on a scale of 1 to 10, it was like a 1, but it was there. So immediately the track, talk about the thought, the track my mind was laying down. I immediately said, oh no, I'm getting a sore throat. I have to do the podcast in an hour. My voice is going to be messed up. Oh my gosh, do I have a fever? I think I might have a fever. Is my head hurting? I think my head hurts. It's like I was imagining all of this stuff.
I know.
First I dialed it back. I was like, wait a minute. Like, you don't have you just have a little bit of a sore throat. And then I was like, okay, I'm focusing on what I don't want. What do I want? I want to feel better. Why? It was like so hard for my mind not to keep going, but my throat hurts, but I think I have chills.
Yeah.
And so I started writing this list. I want to feel better because I want to have a lot of energy. I want to feel good because I want to show up on the podcast happy with my voice in good shape. I tried to stay away from saying I don't want, I don't want a sore throat. I don't want a headache, and just start talking about why I wanted to feel good. And it was really hard to do for some reason. It was hard to do. And when I asked myself, why do you want to feel better? The first answer was because I don't want to feel sick, because I don't want this cold. And that's not the right answer. The right answer is to look for what you want and why. And I did that for, I think it was like a week or 10 days. Like every morning I would wake up and it had started again. And it never got past a certain point. Never. It never bloomed into a full like head cold.
Yeah.
It was trying. And it was easy to go down that track. That track was easy. It was really easy to start saying, oh no, I feel a fever. I feel chills. I feel a headache. I feel, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to be in bed for a week. I'm going to miss out on this and that. It's like so easy to let the train go down that track. So it takes some work because we're not used to it. Like you said.
It takes practice.
Yeah. It takes practice. That's all.
I think it's actually one of the reasons why it's so important to spend time when we're well, when things are going pretty well, appreciating the things that are going well and identifying them and expressing them and saying the positive things, the things that feel good, for the practice of saying them, because it gives us kind of like a vocabulary ammunition when things aren't going right. Like it's a go-to. you know?
Right. And then if you can add that other piece in where recognizing it's a game, and so you're just going to have a completely unreasonable response to something that seems wrong, and just say, yes, excellent. You would never do that, right? But it shifts the energy because you're not going down that groove of being upset about whatever it is.
And amazing things happen when we do that. I mean,
yes.
truly amazing. I mentioned that Louis hurt his calf muscle when he was skiing and he's laid up, right? And so we did a show about that. But on his suggestion, now Louis is about as non-Christian as you and I are, okay? So on his suggestion, we called it prayer and the law of attraction.
Okay.
And what he wanted to do was define what he thought the proper use of prayer was. And what he was suggesting ultimately was everybody else thinking good thoughts for his healing.
Yes, right?
So, but look what happened here. We have a guy who, like you and me, has this big resistance about all that religious stuff, who is now turning and pivoting around because he was feeling so good about it to take a concept and turn it into what he wanted it to be. That's a complete shift of mental track. That's laying new tracks.
That's it. Well, it's funny because I recognized at some point that, you know what, as far as I'm concerned, it's all just the same stuff, whether you want to call it meditation or a prayer or a spell or whatever, which, some people are going to get really out of sorts about that kind of talk. I understand that. I am not casting spells, right? I'm saying prayers. But there are those of us also who are like, yeah, no, I don't want to say that I'm saying prayers because, and it's all just energy. It's all just energy and intention. It's like you said, it's just sending good energy and good intentions. It's intentions for someone's healing, for someone's well-being, for someone's good fortune. That's all we're doing, however we feel most comfortable doing it.
Yeah, that's good. By the way, I had to pass something along to you. You have, whenever you send an email to somebody, your signature at the bottom of the email says "Love and Magic, Cindie."
Yes.
And I mentioned that to Alex yesterday, and she absolutely loved that. So I want you to know, and not only that, she has a similar signature. Her signature is "Have a Magical, Mystical Day." So you guys actually have a little commonality going on right there.
Got
but
it.
both referring to the idea of magic, which is essentially the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the way I think of it. It's just a form that, it's kind of like music, right? Some people, do you like music? Oh, I love music. I love music. Music is my whole life. What kind of music? Country music. Oh, well, I like classical music. So it's like this one over here, it's like, oh, I like jazz and rock and roll, but it's just music, right? And we all like things in certain forms. We have our preferences. We're different. So some of us pray, some of us meditate, some of us chant, some of us cast spells, and some of us do all of it. And
and some of us do podcasts about it.
Right? Exactly. So it's just energy. It's just energy.
It is energy. And that's good. I like the perspective there because it's a reminder that all of these things that we're doing are not only forms of energy, they are expressions of energy. And as such, when we think of them that way, it becomes, I think, easier to shift them if we want to shift them. Just because now, it's just energy I'm dealing with here. I don't have to butt my head up against this major barrier anymore. I can just think of it in terms of shifting energy. And that's a whole lot easier than trying to fight against a barrier.
It's just making choices and shifting energy.
Yeah.
We're just deciding what it is that we want and then shifting the energy so it's aligned with that. So I like this. I like this chapter a whole lot. I like the idea of the game of life. And that we don't have any opponents.
That's true.
Florence Scovill Schinn says there's no competition on the spiritual plane. And I always remember that. Sometimes in business, people get very competitive or they worry about their competition, right?
Sure.
They might worry, coaches might worry about other coaches that are doing this or that, or podcasters might worry about, what about the other podcasts? It's like competition. There's no competition. There's no competition for us. There isn't.
And boy, doesn't that make it a whole lot easier? I mean, when you don't have to go compete against something.
Yeah, we don't.
In fact, there was a time I used to think in terms of competing against myself now I've realized I don't really want to compete against myself. That's just another way of saying I'm wrong. I don't need that.
No, that's being your own worst enemy, right?
It really is.
Earlier.
Yes.
It's like, no, you are not your own opponent even. There's no opponent. There's just no opponent. Just play the game. You can't win it. You can only play it.
You can only play it. That's right.
Only play it. So let's just play it well. Let's just play it as well as we can.
So thanks to Will Smith for sharing that bit of wisdom in the movie Bagger Vance, The Legend of Bagger Vance. Before we go, I want people to know how to reach out to Cindie Chavez, the fantastic life coach, because clearly she's got her magic together. How do you do it?
I would love for you to reach out to me. You can find me on my web. My web address is cindiechavez.com. So CINDIECHAVEZ.com. And there's a contact me form on my website. And that's usually how people get in touch with me. And I'd love to hear from you. If you want to hire me as a coach, that'd be fantastic. But if you also just want to say, hey, I heard you on the podcast, and, just any kind of feedback you give us, we always love to hear from you. People have sent us suggestions on what they liked and what they'd like to hear, and all kinds of things. I just love to have you shout out and say hello.
By the way, you made me think of something. I want to let some listeners know we've received some emails and messages via website and so forth from listeners pointing out that there have been times where our voices, not just yours and mine, but all the co-hosts, the voices tend to be either louder or softer, and sometimes it's hard to keep up, and they're changing volumes and so forth. And I want to let you guys all know the Zoom platform actually gives us a couple different ways to record. Up until about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was recording using the built-in online recording system, but there's a second way you can do it. You can also record locally to the computer, and when you do that, it actually splits the different voices into separate channels. And so I finally put 2 and 2 together to get 4, and I'm not using the pre-recorded versions, the pre-mixed version, I should say. I'm not using that anymore. Instead, I'm taking the individual channels and I'm rebalancing them. So I think people are going to find going forward that the voices are much more even than they were before. And plus, the other nice benefit of doing it this way is that when we go through Zoom, it turns everything into mono. So even the stereo music becomes mono. But when I remix it the way I'm going to remix it, now we get the stereo music again. So we get the stereo music once again. Just a little added benefit.
That's important. Yeah.
That's right. Well, we've already agreed that music is important. I mean, I remember that like a year ago where we were having some technical issues, and there was one point where you couldn't even hear the music, and you were missing it because it was important to hear it when you're doing the show, right?
Yes.
So yeah, very important stuff. So good. Okay. Well, back to Neville again. I'm glad we're doing it. I'm glad we're going to have another week to pick up on him next week, and hopefully we'll get Neville done by the end of the month. We'll see what happens.
That's the plan. But,
That's the plan. In the meantime, we'll have lots and lots of fun. Thank you very much, Cindie. We really appreciate your perspectives and all of this. It's very, very
I love
useful.
being here.
Thank you to our podcast listeners as well, and we'll see you all next time here on LOA Today. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.